Hey everyone, so on today's episode we're going to be breaking out every single actor's portrayal of James Bond and my opinion of how they approach the character, and that is coming up right now. You know what? One of the, in my opinion, most underrated things in the whole Bond series is the fact that we have, if you will, a Bond film for every mood you could possibly be in. If I'm wanting something a bit more light-hearted and fun, yeah, I'll go to put on a Roger Moore James Bond film. If I'm wanting something nostalgic for my youth, I would certainly put on a Pierce Brosnan James Bond film, and with that as well, even if I want to go very much traditional and retro, I'll go put on a Sean Connery Bond film. If I'm wanting something a bit more dark and a bit more serious, I'll put on a Timothy Dalton or a Daniel Craig film. And there's many more variations for that. And the reason I think that is because we've had different portrayals of James Bond. It really is a testament to Ian Fleming's original creation in the novels of his James Bond books that we've had 6 incredible actors give their own interpretation each time to the role of James Bond, and because of that, we as fans have been better for it. And I wanted to look into that today and discuss how I perceive each actor's portrayal as James Bond, see how it compares maybe to yours, how you might see it in a different light because of my reaction. We're going to discuss all of that today, right now. But before we get into that, can I ask, if you haven't already, do give us a like, comment and subscribe to the channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year, so if you can help us, that would be incredible. Without further ado, let's start right off the bat with the first actor, Sean Connery. Now, when it comes to Sean Connery's portrayal of James Bond, obviously this is the very first one, so we have to take that with a grain of salt, but for me, I actually think that Sean Connery's portrayal of James Bond, compared to the novel version of James Bond, is much more darker than I think what we even perceive. For me, after reading the books as well, which has taken effect into how I think about Sean Connery's portrayal of James Bond, this version that he portrays of the character is much more darker, much more calloused, and much more a brute than I think even Ian Fleming wrote in his original novels. It's like he's taken that part of the character, and even for the times that by 10. If you look at the Bond in the novels, he does have a slight, caring side, sympathetic side. Sean Connery at sometimes, it's just ruinous, bluntless, and real sort of, this person is absolutely dangerous. Sean Connery's portrayal, I also feel to me, really embodies that, if you will, dream-esque fantasy version of us men in his portrayal. This is the guy who is the cold-blooded killer, get any girl he wants, because despite what anyone wants to think nowadays, all men wish that they could be this really most coolest guy in the room, get the girl if he's that way inclined that he always wants, and have this amazing fantastical life. Sean Connery for me introduced to the world with Terence Young as the director in Dr. No a whole new version of what a cinema hero is meant to be. I can't help going back to what Timothy Dalton said in the documentary Everything or Nothing. Sean Connery was the meanest, dirtiest, darkest hero at that point in cinema they had ever seen. They really did create a new form of superhero, if you will, a sort of, to a degree, anti-hero. And that's what I think about when it comes to Sean Connery's portrayal of James Bond. He's very much the darker, much more cold-blooded version of the character from the novels, with a much more sense of suave and sophistication, and very much getting off, if you will, on the high-octane thrills of life. Now, moving on to George Lazenby, well, that gets him now a bit more difficult. Let's be fair now, George Lazenby only really got one chance to play James Bond. Obviously that was by his choice, and basically his real solid marching order was this: be Sean Connery. Don't do your own version, be Sean Connery. But with that being said, I feel actually a bit of what George Lazenby's portrayal of James Bond does actually come into that in his own way. I think that George Lazenby for me was the most patriotic James Bond. I really do. I think the real sense of loving Queen and country really does show a lot more in George Lazenby's performance than any other actor who has played James Bond. I also think as well, he's the most cocky Bond. Maybe it's because of his youth, maybe it's that incorporated into how he portrayed James Bond, but outside the patriotism, as I mentioned, that cockiness, that youthful arrogance really I think does show in George Lazenby's performance as James Bond, as it did in the Bond books. Bond always, I think, felt he was better than everybody else. He was smarter. He was just, everything was better he did. And I think George Lazenby portrays that side of the character really well. And On Her Majesty's Secret Service allowed him really to show off that side of the James Bond character really well, which I'm really glad to see. So when I think about George Lazenby's performance, for me, it's the most patriotic of the James Bond actors, and also, if I may, the most cocky. So now, moving on to our longest stinting actor in the role, Roger Moore, at the time of this recording, it's very easy to say that he was the more jubilant Bond, the more sort of schoolboy Bond. You mustn't laugh at it, you must laugh with it, embrace the fantasy element of the character, the great one-liners that Roger Moore did. It's very much easy to say that Roger Moore did a light-hearted approach, and I don't think that's wrong. That is my interpretation of the Roger Moore James Bond. But there's so much more hiding underneath that I think people really do just look over in Roger Moore's performance. The one thing I really saw just watching Roger Moore Bond films again, which really stand out to me, was he never played Bond the same way in each film. Yes, it was all under the umbrella of that you mustn't laugh at it, you must laugh with it. But when the script demanded Roger Moore to be much more serious and darker, my god, he bringed it. When he needed to do another direction, my god, he did it. To me, Roger Moore was very much the actor who played Bond different in every single version of the script that he was given. So for me, Roger Moore probably was the most versatile Bond, because he could play the dark side of the character, he could play the light side of the character, he could play the English gentleman, he could play the rough thug if he needed to. He combined all different elements throughout his 7 films of the character of James Bond and put it in different places there, while also maintaining a sense of suave sophistication, great one-liners, which I still quote to this day, so well done, Roger Moore. At this point as well, I want to just bring up the fact, because this is going to come up a lot, because Dalton really did start wanting to show this concept much more than, say, Connery, I think, or Roger Moore, about Bond being human, how he can make mistakes, how he's very much can get injured, how he can get emotional in the times of these situations, either with the love of his life in those films, or getting angry at, his friends being killed, or whatever, whatever reason. And for me, I just want to mention right here, Dalton, Brosnan, and Craig all tried to show Bond as much more human. So going forward, I'm not going to really talk about the wanting to show Bond being more human, because each of them, in my opinion, have done that in very, very different ways. Now moving on to Timothy Dalton's stint as James Bond, and I think a lot of people would agree with how I'm going to say I feel his portrayal is here, and it's no real surprise here, but I think Timothy Dalton portrays the most closest version of James Bond to the original Ian Fleming written creation. This, to me, Timothy Dalton is the Bond from the books truly brought on screen, and you're never ever going to get anything more closer than what Dalton did. Dalton is dark, he's dangerous, he really does feel like you just plucked the Bond from the books into the 1980s, and he does it so incredibly well, and it's thanks to his amazing performance he could do that. He basically said, again, in the Everything or Nothing documentary, this was the direction he wanted to go in, and I feel he does it so incredibly well. And one of the things that myself just love about his performance as James Bond, it's the little nuances, the little details that he's taken from the novels about James Bond and just brought it into his films. For me, it just shows so much in The Living Daylights and License to Kill. The little details, the little mannerisms that Bond had in the book, he brought into the films there. So for me, to sum up, Timothy Dalton's portrayal of James Bond is the most closest to Ian Fleming's original creation. I think the closest we'll ever get. Right, moving on to now my childhood icon of Bond, Pierce Brosnan as James Bond, my favourite James Bond. How do I feel about his interpretation of Bond? Well, I think he is still to this day the most modern version of James Bond. For me, Brosnan was the Bond who really looked at the character of James Bond from the novels. He looked at all the other interpretations of James Bond and said, right, I'm going to take everything and try and compass it all into the one character. So when I think of Brosnan's Bond, for me, it is the interpretation that tries to take everything from every different other interpretation, and including the books there as well, and incorporate it into his one, while being as much a modern version of the character as possible. And with that as well, I feel that Brosnan's portrayal of James Bond throughout all his films, whatever you think about his films, there's a real timelessness to it. You could plop the Pierce Brosnan James Bond in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the noughties, the 2010s. He could just fit absolutely anywhere. So for me, Brosnan Bond, without a shadow of a doubt, is the timeless James Bond, the one who encompasses the most out of all the character of James Bond. For me, if I would have had to sum up Daniel Craig's James Bond, I think if you will, the interpretation of the character of he is a bad guy working for the good guys is to me how I would sum up the Daniel Craig James Bond. And I think the big other side of the Daniel Craig interpretation of James Bond, and again this is my interpretation only, is not since the books have we seen Bond go on a bit of an emotional story arc. And I think Craig's Bond very much is the Bond that will give you an emotional arc. There's no denying it that Craig's era is designed to have beginning, middles, and an actual definitive end. And in the books, we obviously see Bond develop and grow in the novels, and I think we also saw that in part of the novels brought into Craig's Bond, where we saw him at, as I say, the beginning, Casino Royale, developing, learning in, Quantum of Solace and Spectre and Skyfall, and then obviously finally having a dramatic ending in No Time to Die. When I think of the Daniel Craig James Bond, for me, the two things that really come out is this concept really truly of the bad guy working for the good guys, while also being the Bond that had the emotional story arc of having, if you will, you see his life from beginning to end, which is actually a really interesting little perspective on it. Right everyone, that is the end of my variation and portrayal of what I think each actor has done in the role of James Bond. But I want to know, what do you think about my interpretations? Do you agree? Do you disagree? I want to know. Comment down below and tell me what you think. As always everyone, my name's Henry Stevens and this has been the Bond Geek. Goodbye.